well, good Friday morning. I hope that you've had a great week. I know as I've traveled this week up to central Iowa, you get north I-70, a lot of corn starting to come out of the fields. People are starting to cut a little bit of beans. Even here in west central Missouri, we're starting to take a lot of corn out of the field, and we just picked up a really nice rain. So it's been a good week as I think about what's kind of going on in our area. This week, I wanted to continue on talking about what should we be looking at with our dry fertilizer program this fall. Last week, we talked about phosphorus. We talked about how is it held in the soil when we talked about ways we maximize getting it out. This week, I wanted to talk a little bit about potassium. Now, one nice thing, if we can call it nice at this point, is when you look at pricing of potassium, it's a little bit more competitively priced. Still not where we want it to be, but still a little bit more competitively priced. But I still think it's important that we talk about how are we going to maximize our fertilizer dollar as we're moving through this fall, looking forward into 2026. So first of all, let's talk about a couple things with potassium. So after you get your soil test back, how is potassium going to be shown on that result? Well, usually there's two ways. You'll have a base saturation, and then you'll either have it reported as a parts per million or a pounds per acre, right? We can easily convert between those two by simply multiplying by 2. So why are we talking about both a parts per million and a base saturation? Well, let's kind of talk about it this way. Parts per million is simply when we pull that soil test, that is that potassium that's going to be available to the plant. When we think about a base saturation, it's really kind of almost a ratio if we want to think about it that way, because the other three that are the three that we're seeing in there are going to be this idea of potassium, magnesium, calcium. Now you can have a couple of others, right? And as we get into some of those different spots, maybe sodium comes into play if we're having some drainage issues or we just have some soils that are high in that and we're battling it. But why are we looking at that base saturation? Because it gives us an idea of how all of those relate to one another. But as we think about what is found in that soil, whether we're looking at parts per million or base saturation, let's talk a little bit about the 3 pools that we can find our potassium in. Let's start with the plant available pool, right? That is going to be the pool that the plant is going to easily be able to take up out of the soil, which is great. Unfortunately, that is the smallest pool that we're going to have in our soil. A lot of times we're not talking much more than just a few percent is going to be available at any one time. Then we have our other 2 pools, and these are going to be the pools that are not immediately available to the plant. However, they can be massive. I've seen estimates of more than 50,000 parts per million, some 100,000 parts per million of potassium total in the soil, but they're held in these pools that are not available. So what are those? Well, the first one could just be considered to be what's called a primary mineral, or the completely unavailable, and it's actually held in the structure of that clay. It's how the clay is going to be built up, and it's going to be released extremely slowly as we have some weathering that goes through. That is why it's important when we do and we look at our soil surveys, we see what our base material or our parent material is going to be. The second pool is going to be that pool where we see a little bit more exchange happening. And this exchange can simply be the way that it's being held on between different clay molecules. And if we have moisture, it's going to open those up and allow a little bit more to be released. When it dries down, a lot of times that becomes unavailable potassium. Speaking of moisture, when we think about how moisture is going to impact how plants are going to take potassium up, it is a huge influence, because we know that we have to have moisture in the ground for these plants to be able to drink up that potassium. Why is it so important? And when we think about what potassium does in a plant, we can pretty much put it in every single bucket within the plant. It helps mobilize nutrients when we're thinking about water, we're thinking about carbohydrates, we're thinking about protein movement. All 3 of those are going to be governed by potassium. It helps regulate the stomata, right? The openings, those little guard cells that almost look like a donut around theirs. Potassium plays a key role in keeping those stomata open. Why do we care about that? That's where our CO2 is going to come in for photosynthesis. It's key component then across the entire board, from nutrient uptake, mobilization within the plant, and then photosynthesis. That's why it's so important as we think about this potassium. So we understand the importance of potassium everywhere from stalk strength to nutrient mobility within the plant, even helping to drive photosynthesis. But how are we going to really maximize this? How are we going to make sure we get it into the plant? Well, the first thing is we do have to make sure we have pounds on the ground. That is one thing about potassium. You look at 220 bushel an acre corn, you look at 70 bushel an acre soybean crops, and you look at the total amount that's needed. We're talking hundreds of pounds that are going to be required. So we do have to build that. However, if the environment doesn't match up, if we don't get that moisture, if we don't have good root growth, it doesn't actually end up mattering all that much in the long run. So let's talk about some ways that we can be creative. I'm going to go back to what we talked about last week with phosphorus, mycorrhizal fungi. I'm a huge fan of mycorrhizal fungi, but when we think about potassium uptake, man, mycorrhizal fungi is such an easy way to enhance what our roots are doing. We get a larger root system with all those filaments that are going to be growing off the end, and we know that it can help pull those nutrients in and exchange those in the roots for a little bit of carbohydrates. So that's always going to be my first go-to. What are we doing root structure? Staying with root structure, we need to make sure that our practices are working to enhance root growth. What's the moisture when we're out planting? Do we have a big compaction issue? Do we have a compacted zone in our field? We need to make sure that we're looking at managing that so we can enhance that root growth. We can also be creative though. Outside of just putting on some dry fertility, there's been some really neat research that's been published in the last 5, 6, 7 years, actually looking at pairing a potassium acetate, which is a liquid form of potassium highly available to the plants, with our side dress when we're going out with our UAN. So when we think about that, we're already making a pass through the field, and the research looked at adding somewhere between 10 and 40 pounds of potassium with potassium acetate. Again, plant available form, we can drop it right there in the field where those roots are, and we're pairing it with a pass through the field anyway, so we aren't going to incur that extra expense. So again, as we think about potassium, we know we've got to build pounds on the ground, but I also feel like we have to start getting creative, maximize those root systems, utilize proven biologicals like a mycorrhizal fungi, and maybe take a look, run some test strips in your fields, run some side-by-sides. What happens if we pair a potassium acetate when you're outside dressing? Not getting rid of all the pounds on the ground, but simply putting it there when the plant needs it in a plant available form. Well, I hope that you've had a great week. I really do enjoy hearing from you guys in terms of what are you doing for dry fertility? What's been working? What hasn't been working? So make sure you let me know and have a great week.